see you this evening. We, there, you think I'd be ready? Almost am. We're kind of at a place in Acts that we're not going to spend a lot of time because I don't want to bog you down in it. Luke was really good about history, historical facts, because he wanted you to know that it was real. That's how we do it, right? That's how you know history's real. History is muddy. You agree with me? History's kind of muddy sometimes. A lot of things we know, we think we know, but those things get distorted over time, don't they? Did George Washington really chop down a cherry tree? I don't know, I don't know. Maybe, who knows? Maybe not. Did Paul Bunyan have a blue ox? Kind of doubt it, Some stuff's folklore, right? It's becomes folk tales, right? Like Johnny Appleseed and Paul Bunyan and John Henry. And, is there basis to fact to some of that? Was there really a John Henry? Yeah, there was really a John Henry, right? Did he die with a hammer in his hand? Maybe, I don't know. I don't know these things. I'm sure there was a Johnny Appleseed, but I'm sure he didn't do what they said Johnny Appleseed did, right? So, where do we draw the line with history, right? It was really funny when I went to college, first history class I ever took in college at OU. When I walked in, he said, his basic premise was, I'm going to destroy everything you learned in high school, right? In other words, I'm going to tell you what the real history is, not the watered down view of history, right? But I'm going to tell you what the real history is. And, because really, real history is messy, right? When we're kids, when we're in junior high and high school or grade school especially, they kind of gloss it up. Do you kind of agree with that? They kind of gloss it up, right? They'll make it look a little better. George Washington was a great leader and a great president and all that, but we're not going to get into the fact that he had concubines and he had these extra affairs, he had all this stuff. We're not going to talk about that in grade school, right, or high school. And with the Bible, when we start talking about biblical history, it becomes even maybe more difficult. It's 2,000 years ago, start with, right? It's 2,000 years ago now. We absolutely have very little now that existed at the time of Christ. We just don't have it. There's other writings besides the Bible, right? We know that. Apocryphal writings and what we call Gnostic writings, Gnostic Gospels, Nag Hammadi. And, a lot of those we consider to be folklore, folk tale, because they're 200 years, 300 years after Christ. So we don't take those to be inspired writings. They say a lot of really weird stuff, if you ever read that, which I do because I'm a weird guy. And they say a lot of really weird stuff, right? And, that we don't see in the Gospels. But Luke was a historian. So Luke really wanted us to have a historical, documented account of what was going on. Unfortunately, in the first century, we didn't have the calendar we have today. Didn't exist, right? Matter of fact, our calendar didn't come along till centuries after. And back then, they didn't tell time like you and I tell time, by date and year. The way they told time was by events. Who was in power? What was going on? That's how you told time. So when Luke in Acts starts talking about these people, historical people, he's giving you a basis of fact. He's giving you a time. He's saying, this actually occurred, and this is when it occurred. And when we get to 25, right? We get to 25, Felix is out. Felix is left. Festus is here now. Festus kind of wants to appease the Jews, as they all did, because they understood that the Jewish revolt was imminent, It was kind of like sitting on a powder keg. They knew the Jews weren't happy, and they knew there was a real militant faction of Judaism, and they knew that the best way they could keep peace in that part of the world was to make the Jews happy. That was how we're going to do it. In 71 AD, that all fell apart. But up until then, we want to try to keep the Jews happy. And so they tried to appease them, and that's what's going on here. It was a favor. They wanted to take him to Jerusalem because they knew in Jerusalem they could kill him. They would have some sway. They could ambush him. They could do something with him. So once again, now Paul's been under house arrest under Felix. Paul's been under house arrest. Now we've changed to Festus, and Festus is wanting to help the Jews. So now we're going to try this again under Festus. So the Jews are going to come up. We're going to try it again, right? We're going to bring these Jewish lawyers up. We're going to make a case against Paul. Paul basically is right where he always was, right? I haven't done anything wrong. Nothing that I need to stand trial for. I'm in a Roman court, not in a Jewish court. I've done nothing to the Romans. I've done nothing to the Jews. But in 11, he makes a really big thing. And this is kind of an interesting, I appeal to Caesar, he says. So Paul's a Roman citizen, and he has a right to do that, just as you and I have a right in our judicial system to appeal a case. And I guess if it's a big enough case, we can appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, that's what he said. He said, I'm going to appeal this to Caesar. Now, the way I understand this wasn't quite as binding as the Bible makes it seem. I kind of studied this a little in the past. But in this case, they're willing to do this. So they're going to transport Paul to Caesar in order for him to stand trial in Caesar's court. That's a really big thing. Now, at this time, that's Nero, okay? Nero is the Caesar in power at the time this is going on. And Nero is going to really turn against Christians. Not quite yet, but he really is going to turn against Christians. And so he appeals to that. And Festus says, okay, you're going to go. But then there's another problem here. What's the charge? You see? In other words, all right, you can appeal to Caesar, I'm going to send you to Caesar, but if I send you all the way to Caesar and I don't have a charge, that's going to look really bad on me. Like I wasted all this Roman manpower and Roman time and Roman money to send this guy, and yet I really don't have anything against, really don't have any charge, right? I don't know what it is. Why am I sending him there? And so that's where we get into this next kind of phase in this. They did not delay. They wanted to bring him in. They want to find a charge. Like I said, I'm not going to bog you down with every word in this. If you look at 19, it said they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion, right? And a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. I didn't know how to investigate it. When he made his appeal, I held him. But then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this. Now, this is Agrippa the second, okay? Agrippa the first is the Agrippa that killed James. This is Agrippa the second. In a minute, we're going to introduce Bernice. Bernice is Agrippa the second's sister. Bernice and Agrippa the second are Agrippa the first's children. And there was a rumor they had an incestuous relationship. That's another thing we wouldn't talk about in our childhood history class, right? It was rumored they had an incestuous relationship, although that was never really proven. But they're brother and sister. They're Herod Agrippa the first's children. So that's kind of who they are. If you remember right, God told Paul he would stand before kings. And so this is kind of what the fulfillment of this. The idea here is that I need to find a charge. So Bernice comes. Bernice, interestingly enough, Bernice wound up after this. She had a kind of a fling with one of the emperors, but that really didn't last but a couple of years. Then she just kind of vanished from history. So, but they're brother and sister. This Agrippa the second. And he said, Paul once again make his defense. But if you look at 26, you kind of get the problem. I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write, for I think it is unreasonable to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. So that's the crux of it. right? In other words, if I send him all the way up there and I don't have anything to say, then that doesn't look very good on me. But once again, if you'll notice, Luke is very specific about these events. The people, the place, who was in power, who was doing all this, because he wants to put a time frame on it. Once I said, history's muddy, right? How do we know something's historically accurate? How do you know that? How do you take a piece of history, whatever that might be, and how do you decide that's the truth? You ever really thought about that? I mean, I have been alive for most of history, not a lot of it, right? So how do you take something somebody's told you, this is what happened? You really want to know if that's really what happened? How do you approach that? Have you ever really thought about that? How do you prove that the history you've heard is a history that actually occurred? More than one eyewitness. Absolutely. Eyewitness accounts. That's one of the biggest things about history. You want to read something from somebody that actually saw it with their own eyes. You don't want to read. So what's when we look at the Bible? So how do we know the Bible's authentic? How do we know it's accurate? Why? Are there other books? Yes. Why do we have what we have, right? One of the criteria for books of the Bible was first-hand account. First-hand account. So in other words, I'm not going to get somebody that wrote 100 years after Jesus. I'm going to get somebody that was there when Jesus was alive. First-hand account. That's one way. And Billy brought up another one. More than one. Right? Am I right? One account cannot prove history because it can be jaded. It can be slighted, right? You can put forth your own agenda, right? So for something to be historical, we want more than one account of the event, right? I had a young person in this church ask me, was kind of disturbed about her baptism. She said, I was baptized. She says, but I really don't know if I believe in Jesus. You know, that's tough, isn't it? That's a big thing, isn't it? And how do you answer that with a young child? Well, why were you baptized? Well, I thought everybody was doing it, Doesn't that happen a lot with kids, right? We get caught up in it, right? And so she asked that question. She says, I really don't know that I believe that Jesus Christ is God's Son. So how do you deal with that? What do you say? What would you say? Huh? You can say what the Bible says, but then she could say, but how do we know how do we know that's true? Mm-hmm. It's hard, isn't it? It's a hard question because on one hand, you want to be logical. On the other hand, faith isn't all logic. Faith is faith, right? So how do you approach it? Well, I think you have to approach it like you approach anything that's that type of question. And I think one way you start that is you have to ask yourself the question, why do I believe in Jesus? If I expect somebody else to believe in Jesus, if I expect somebody else to believe that Jesus Christ is God's Son, then I think the first thing I really got to ask myself is, why do I believe that? Right? What's my rationality? Right? Some people, that's a pretty tough question to answer. Would you agree with me? I've heard stuff like, well, I've never doubted it. Why? Right? Why have you never doubted it? Well, that's my mama believed that, and my grandma believed that, and I was just raised up in the church, and I've never doubted it. That's a pretty weak argument. Just throwing that down. That's a pretty weak argument, right? Yeah, I think that's one thing you really have to start with somebody. That's one thing that I told her. I said the first thing is the Bible's a historical text, right? It's not a once upon a time in a land far away. The Bible's a historical text. I can tell you when it happened. I can tell you where it happened. I can tell you those places still exist today. If the Bible says there's a place, there's a place. If you ever used to read Louis Lamar, I used to read him when I was a kid all the time, and he had a big ranch down by Durango. Of course, I lived in Colorado for years, and one of the things in his books, he always said, if I say there's a stream or there's a spring or there's a creek or there's a pass, he says it really exists, It's really there. It's one thing he always said about his books, Well, the Bible's historical, and, Luke really drives that home. Of course, a lot of other things do. Are there other texts? Yeah, Josephus. But the truth is, we throw Josephus out there a lot, but he doesn't say a lot about biblical things. But he does some, but that's not really his focus. But that's one thing we have to say. It's a historical text. The other thing we have to say is it's multiple first-hand accounts, right? In other words, it's not just one gospel. It's 4 gospels, right? That say this, that talk about the same thing. Luke's a historian, not a, his motivation was not to push something on somebody to make. His motivation, according to Luke and according to Acts, was to give a historical record, to give an account of what you believe, that these things are true, right? So, you have to start with that idea, because a lot of times we really kind of turn the Bible into a fairy tale. If I say Noah's Ark, just throwing this, and I shouldn't have said it to quit, because what I should have said is, I want you to think with me for a minute, and I'm going to say something, and I want you to tell me the first picture that comes in your mind. And I want to say Noah's Ark. And I want to say, what's the first picture that comes in your mind? Be honest with me. Yeah, Carrie's laughing. She teaches little kids. That's what we see, isn't it? Isn't that what you see in your head? If I say Noah's Ark, you see this big, funky-looking boat with giraffes and elephants sticking out of it. We kind of make it into a fairy tale, don't we? Right? Don't we? And that's how we. And so when we if you ever go to the Noah's Ark exhibit, that's one thing he really focuses on. He has a whole section about how we've turned it into a fairy tale instead of into something that's real, something that's a reality. We've turned it into this like fairy tale thing, and we've turned it into this little children's story, when the truth is it's a real biblical text, and a real factual biblical text. And we've done that with a lot of the Bible. We kind of fairy tale it as children, and a lot of times those images are the images that exist within our mind. If I say, what does Jesus Christ look like? And even though you don't know what Jesus, and you know in your mind you don't know what Jesus Christ looks like, every one of you has got a picture of Jesus Christ in your head. Promise you, right? Because that's what we do. And so we have to somehow make it real, a real text, real time, real events, real history, real places. And the beautiful thing about Paul, the beautiful thing about Acts, and the beautiful thing about Paul is that whereas Jesus was mostly in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's been invaded and conquered and covered and burnt and rebuilt so many times in 2,000 years, it's ridiculous, right? So even though you might go to Jerusalem, you really don't know anything, because, trust me, that place has been burned and built so many times. But Paul, where Paul was, that really is there. Ephesus, Rome, those places are still there. So it's really kind of interesting in this historical idea. And I'm sorry to kind of get off the point, but people say a lot of times when I get to this part of Acts, they're like, oh, that bogs me down, Rex. I don't know why we got to talk about this. And, it really slows me down. And I just want to tell you that, I know it does, and I don't want to burden you like reading every word of this text. But if you go back and read it for yourself, really what you're looking at is this historical record that Luke is setting forth. And so I think it's really important. And so when somebody says, well, why do you believe the Bible? Because if you look at this is true. This is real. This is as real as can be real, right? And it's real time, real events, real people, real places. And that's important. And it's a funny thing is we're going to talk about Paul's shipwreck before we get done with this. And I might have told you this story, but it's a fascinating story to me. There was a guy that was a Marine, and I'll probably have to tell you this again when we get there, but there was a guy that was a Marine archaeologist, did not believe in the Bible because he said, because of that one verse, because it says when Paul had a shipwreck, it said that they put ropes underneath the ship to hold it together, to bind it together. And he said he knew that at that time in history, they didn't do that, and that because of that, he didn't believe in the Bible. Interestingly enough, there was an archaeological dig. They dug up a ship from that time. Guess what? Had ropes underneath the hull. Guy converted to Christianity because there were ropes underneath the bottom of a ship. That's a verse that means absolutely nothing to me, right? But it converted somebody because he said, now I know it's true. Isn't that what we want? We want to know it's true, right? And so you never know how it's going to hit somebody, right? They want him. The synagogue wants him. The priests want him. He goes back. He's recounting his story once again. At noon on the road. We've talked about that. Light blazing, fell to the ground. Paul once again recants his conversion, recants what happened. To turn them from darkness to light, from Satan to God, they may receive forgiveness of sins. And he placed among those who are sanctified by faith. And King Agrippa was not disobedient to the vision. He says, of God's help this very day, I stand and testify to small and great alike. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. Christ would suffer as the first to rise from the dead, would proclaim light to his own people and to the Gentiles. The funny thing is he's saying this, he's talking to people who had firsthand account of what happened. You ever thought about that? When you ever read 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul says, he says, this gospel I preached to you, that Jesus Christ died according to the Scriptures, raised according to the Scripture, buried according to the Scriptures, right? And he appeared to Peter first, and to James and the other apostles, and to me as in one untimely born, and to 500 at one time, many of whom, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, many of whom are still alive to this day. Paul was basically throwing it in their face, saying, There's people who saw the resurrected Christ that are still alive right now. If you don't believe me, go ask them. That's really powerful. That's a really powerful statement in the Bible. That Paul's basically throwing that out there and saying, if you don't believe me, go ask somebody who saw him. And yet, they didn't refute it. Those are the things that we base our faith on. You say, well, it takes faith, and it takes faith, but God never asked us to have blind faith. God asks us to have a faith, an educated faith, I would like to say. Yeah, it is. You still got to have faith to get to where you need to be beyond a shadow of a doubt. But it's not blind, right? It's not blind. There's a logical basis to faith. He says, Agrippa says, I know you do. He says, do you believe this, basically? And Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, short time or long, I pray that everyone would be as I am, except for these chains. And then this man is not doing it through his death or imprisonment. Agrippa said this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. But he needed to appeal to Caesar because that was going to get him to Rome. That was his way to get to Rome. And the other thing is that all this imprisonment time, all this time in Rome, Paul's writing letters, Paul's doing things, Paul's still ministering, Paul's still spreading the gospel, Paul's still doing all the things that Paul does. So I know it gets kind of bogged down right in here when we get into Acts, but I just kind of want you to know that there's a reason that this is here. And it proves to us, we set it beside history and we go, yeah, this really happened. These people really existed. This really happened. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a once upon a time. This is a real book about real events and real people, and we can set some stock in that, I think, as Christians. So, anyway, thanks for your time this evening. Have a good rest of the week.